The 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon took effect on the night of April 16, 2026, at 9 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. The war it paused had been running for 46 days, from March 2nd to April 16th, killing 2,294 people by Lebanese health ministry count, and wounding 7,544 more. 1.2 million Lebanese had been displaced from their homes during those 46 days, a number that represents roughly 1/5 of Lebanon's entire population. The highways south and into Beirut's southern suburbs were jammed with traffic on Friday, April 17th, as families in cars piled with blankets and salvaged belongings drove back toward homes they had not seen in weeks, homes that, in many cases, no longer existed in recognizable form. The ceasefire was brokered by the United States and represented, according to Lebanon's President Joseph Aoun, a moment when, and I am quoting his direct words, Lebanon has reclaimed its decision. Prime Minister Nawaf Salam said the government's decision to disarm Hezbollah was irreversible. For the first time since the failure of the May 17th agreement in 1983, which was 43 years ago, Israel and the Lebanese government announced the opening of direct negotiations toward a genuine peace agreement. The ceasefire was, in the framing of everyone who had any role in producing it, the beginning of a political process that Lebanon had not been able to access in living memory. That framing lasted approximately 4 hours, because within hours of the ceasefire taking effect, Israeli forces were documented carrying out demolitions, artillery shelling, and land clearing operations in multiple border areas in violation of the ceasefire agreement. And on Saturday, April 18th, the Israeli military officially announced what it called a yellow line, a military security zone stretching roughly 10 kilometers north of the Israeli border across the entire width of southern Lebanon, encompassing 55 Lebanese villages whose residents were declared forbidden from returning, modeled explicitly after the buffer zone that Israel had imposed in Gaza. Netanyahu said it himself in the specific language that removes all ambiguity. He said, "We are remaining in Lebanon in a reinforced security buffer zone. This is a security strip 10 kilometers deep, which is much stronger, more intense, more continuous, and more solid than what we had previously." And 5 days after the yellow line was declared, on Tuesday, April 21st, 2026, day 5 of the 10-day ceasefire, Hezbollah fired several rockets at Israeli troops in the Rab al-Thalathin area inside the Israeli-held security zone and launched a drone toward Israeli territory. Air raid sirens sounded in the northern Israeli border communities of Kfar Yuval and Ma'ayan Baruch. The drone was intercepted before crossing into Israeli territory. The IDF struck the rocket launcher within minutes. Hezbollah publicly took responsibility and said the attacks came in response to the blatant and documented violations by Israel. The IDF called it a blatant violation of the ceasefire agreement. It was the first time Hezbollah had fired at Israeli forces since the ceasefire took effect 5 days earlier. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what the yellow line is, why Netanyahu declared it within 24 hours of a ceasefire he himself had agreed to, why 2,294 Lebanese dead in 46 days of ground invasion were not enough to change the fundamental dynamic of Lebanon's southern border, why the French UNIFIL peacekeeper Sergeant Major Florian Montorio's death on April 18th is the specific event that illuminates everything about why this ceasefire was never going to hold in its announced form, and why the rockets at Rab al-Thalathin on Tuesday evening were not a surprise to any analyst who had read the ceasefire's text and watched what Israel did in the first 24 hours after signing it. The 46 days that produced the ceasefire began on March 2nd, 2026, 3 days after the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran on February 28th, when Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening wave of strikes, and Iran's IRGC activated its full regional deterrence architecture. Hezbollah resumed rocket and drone attacks against northern Israel that had been nominally halted under the November 2024 ceasefire framework. The November 2024 ceasefire was itself a fragile arrangement under which, as NPR confirmed, the UN had recorded more than 10,000 violations by Israeli forces in its first months, 10,000 violations in a ceasefire that preceded this one. The operational reality that produced the 46-day March to April war was not a sudden breakdown of a functioning peace, but the resumption of active hostilities after a nominally frozen conflict that had been maintained in frozen form by American diplomatic pressure while both sides continuously prepared for the moment the pressure was removed. When Iran's deterrence architecture activated on February 28th, the pressure was removed. Hezbollah fired into northern Israel. Israel responded with airstrikes across Lebanon. The Israeli army launched a ground invasion on March 16th, eventually deploying 5 divisions into southern Lebanon. The fighting ran from March 2nd to April 16th, producing the death toll and displacement figures that any objective accounting requires to be stated at the beginning of any analysis of what came next, because the ceasefire that the yellow line declared occurred in a country where 2,294 people had died in 46 days and 7,544 had been wounded. and where 1.2 million civilians were trying to return to homes that Israeli forces were demolishing from the inside of a newly declared military buffer zone during the ceasefire that was supposed to allow them to come back. The yellow line announced on April 18th is the Gaza model applied to Lebanon, and the specific comparison to Gaza is not editorial framing on my part. It is the language that the senior Israeli military officials used when they briefed reporters on Saturday. They said, and this is the reported verbatim language, the yellow line model implemented in Gaza will be replicated in Lebanon. The IDF has already established a yellow line, and its forces are currently working towards it. The Gaza yellow line is the dividing boundary inside the Gaza Strip that Israel drew to separate areas under its military control from areas notionally accessible to Palestinian civilians. A line that has moved repeatedly and that has never produced the secure conditions for civilian return that it was described as enabling. The Lebanon Yellow Line, 10 kilometers deep along the entire length of the Israeli-Lebanese border, covers an area that the Wikipedia Lebanon War entry describes as larger than Israeli ground forces actually controlled at the moment of the ceasefire, meaning Israel declared a buffer zone that extended beyond the territory it had already captured and continued capturing new areas within that zone during the ceasefire. The Worthy News analysis confirmed that approximately 55 Lebanese villages were declared off-limits, their residents barred from returning in order to safeguard Israeli forces operating in the region. The Legal Agenda's monitoring report documented 220 Israeli ceasefire breaches between April 17th and April 19th, the first 3 days of the truce, killing 3 people and wounding 7, including 4 paramedics. The violations included airstrikes, detonations, destruction of infrastructure, artillery shelling, machine gun fire, and overflights by military and reconnaissance aircraft, including over Beirut. 220 violations in 3 days, 63 violations per day in a 10-day ceasefire. The Al Jazeera analysis, published 3 days into the ceasefire, documented the demolitions with geographic specificity. Armored vehicles and excavators demolishing houses in Mays al-Jabal, bulldozers continuing demolition and land clearing operations in Beit Leaf, Alcantara, and Toul, artillery shelling in multiple areas. The IDF soldier killed on April 17th after entering a building rigged with explosives by Hezbollah, and the second soldier killed on April 18th when a bulldozer drove over an explosive device. 9 others wounded, confirmed that the Israeli military operations that constituted ceasefire violations were active rather than accidental, because soldiers doing active bulldozing of buildings and soldiers leading convoys into contested territory do not describe a force in defensive posture awaiting negotiation. They describe a force using the ceasefire window to extend the geographic scope of its operational zone. Defense Minister Israel Katz's statement on Friday, April 18th, is the most institutionally precise articulation of Israel's position, and it deserves to be quoted in its full operational content. He said the Israeli Defense Forces will continue to hold and control all the positions it has cleared and secured. This is not the language of a military that signed a cessation of hostilities and is maintaining its current positions while diplomacy proceeds. It is the language of a military that is actively incorporating all cleared and secured territory into its permanent operational control and will continue doing so regardless of the ceasefire's existence. Netanyahu's security strip, 10 kilometers deep, which is much stronger, more intense, more continuous, and more solid than what we had previously, is the political declaration of a territorial acquisition. The yellow line is not a temporary security measure pending diplomatic resolution. It is the announced endpoint of a military campaign that has destroyed villages, displaced 1.2 million people, killed 2,294, and now holds 55 of Lebanon's southernmost villages empty of their residents inside a zone that Israel has publicly stated it intends to keep under military control indefinitely. The New Arab Analysis, published on April 22, 2026, stated this outcome plainly. The razing of villages and creation of a buffer zone separated by a yellow line show the ceasefire won't stop Israel from entrenching its hold on South Lebanon. When the ceasefire expires, if it is not extended, Israel will still hold the yellow line. When the ceasefire is extended, Israel will still hold the yellow line. The yellow line is not contingent on the ceasefire. It is what Israel intends to retain after the ceasefire resolves or expires. Hezbollah was not a formal signatory to the April 16th ceasefire. This is the structural fact that the framing of the ceasefire as a bilateral agreement between Israel and Lebanon consistently obscures, and it is the fact that explains every subsequent development in the first 5 days of the truce. The ceasefire agreement was reached between the government of Israel and the government of Lebanon. The government of Lebanon is the civilian and military governmental structure led by President Joseph Aoun and Prime Minister Nawaf Salam. Lebanon's government outlawed Hezbollah's military wing at the start of the latest round of conflict. Hezbollah is an armed organization that operates inside Lebanon and is not legally part of Lebanon's government, even though it has political representatives in Lebanon's parliament and wielded effective veto power over Lebanese governance for years. When the ceasefire was signed by Lebanon, Hezbollah was not in the room, did not agree to the terms, and was under no binding obligation to comply with an agreement that the government that signed it cannot enforce, because enforcing it would require Lebanon's army to disarm Hezbollah by force, which the Lebanese army has never done, and which would constitute a Lebanese civil conflict of the kind Lebanon has not seen since the 1970s. The ceasefire text, as the Wikipedia Lebanon ceasefire entry confirmed, specified that Lebanon would take steps to prevent Hezbollah and other non-state armed groups from carrying out attacks against Israel. Taking steps to prevent Hezbollah attacks is the legal language for a Lebanese government obligation that Lebanon's government cannot operationally fulfill. Lebanon cannot order Hezbollah to disarm and have the order enforced. Prime Minister Nawaf Salam's statement that the government's decision to disarm Hezbollah was irreversible is a statement of governmental intention, not a statement of capability. And Hezbollah Secretary General Naim Qassem made his own position unmistakable on the first day of the ceasefire. He said, "A ceasefire means a complete cessation of all hostilities. Because we do not trust this enemy, the resistance fighters will remain in the field with their hands on the trigger, and they will respond to violations accordingly. Hands on the trigger, response to violations accordingly." That is the statement of an armed organization that signed nothing, trusts the ceasefire with the trust they would extend to any Israeli commitment given their documented history of the previous ceasefire's 10,000 violations, and reserves the right to respond when they assess that Israel has violated the terms. Qassem added that the ongoing 10-day truce cannot continue unless both sides uphold it. The legal agenda documented 220 Israeli violations in the first 3 days. Hezbollah waited until day 5 to fire. On any proportional count of violation to response, Hezbollah showed more restraint than the documentation suggests they were legally obligated to, under the terms Qassem publicly announced. The French UNIFIL Sergeant Major Florian Montorio was killed on April 18, 2026, in the village of Gandourieh in southern Lebanon. He was 29 years old. He was a member of the 17th Parachute Engineer Regiment based in Montauban, France. He was on a mission to open a route toward a UNIFIL post that had been isolated for several days due to fighting between Hezbollah and Israeli forces in the area, according to French Armed Forces Minister Catherine Vautrin. He was caught in an ambush by an armed group at very close range, she said on X. He was killed by a direct gunshot. 3 other French UNIFIL peacekeepers were wounded in the ambush, 2 of them seriously. French President Emmanuel Macron said everything suggests that responsibility for this attack lies with Hezbollah. The UNIFIL force's initial assessment attributed the attack to Hezbollah. Hezbollah denied responsibility and called for a Lebanese investigation. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres condemned the attack. Macron called Lebanese President Aoun and Prime Minister Salam to demand the identification and prosecution of those responsible. The specific operational reality that placed Sergeant Major Montorio in that road in Gandourieh is the Yellow Line. His patrol was opening a route to a UNIFIL post isolated by the fighting that both Israel's ceasefire violations and Hezbollah's presence had produced in the villages now inside Israel's declared buffer zone. A UN peacekeeper trying to restore access to an isolated position inside a Lebanese village that Israel has declared a military zone, where Israeli forces are conducting active demolitions, where Hezbollah maintains weapons and fighters that it explicitly said would stay in the field with hands on the trigger, is occupying the most dangerous terrain imaginable. The space between 2 armed forces that are violating a ceasefire from opposite sides of a theoretical line that neither of them respects in practice. Montorio's death is not a side story to the Yellow Line. It is the direct operational consequence of declaring a military zone inside a country whose armed government cannot enforce the ceasefire, whose armed non-state militia said it was keeping its weapons deployed, and whose UN peacekeeping force is mandated to operate in exactly the territory where both armed parties are actively violating a truce that has been in effect for fewer than 48 hours. Hezbollah's April 19th tank column ambush is the specific event between the UNIFIL killing and the April 21st rocket attack that confirms the ceasefire's trajectory. On the afternoon of April 19th, Hezbollah members used explosive devices against a column of Israeli tanks between Taiba and Deir Syrian in southern Lebanon. The 2026 Lebanon War Wikipedia entry confirmed this incident explicitly. Israel warned residents of southern Lebanon to stay out of the area following the ambush. That warning, issued during a ceasefire that was supposed to allow 2 million displaced people to return home, is the operational instruction of a military that has no intention of permitting return to the territory inside the Yellow Line. The ceasefire's text says Lebanon must take steps to prevent Hezbollah from carrying out attacks against Israel. The ceasefire's text does not say Israel must permit Lebanese civilians to return to their villages. The ceasefire's text says Israel retains the right to act in self-defense against imminent or ongoing threats while refraining from offensive military operations. The 220 violations documented by the legal agenda in the first 3 days were Israeli actions. The Israeli military's defense is that each individual action was a defensive response to an imminent or ongoing threat. Now, the yellow line itself, the demolitions, the artillery shelling, the bulldozing of residential infrastructure, are all being characterized by Israeli officials as actions within the scope of the self-defense reservation in the ceasefire text. The ceasefire text has a self-defense carve-out large enough to accommodate the destruction of 55 villages and the installation of a permanent military zone across 10% of Lebanon's sovereign territory. And Israel is using that carve-out systematically and publicly from the first hours of the truce. The Hezbollah rockets at Rab al-Thalathin on Tuesday, April 21st, arrived on the day that the Iran-US ceasefire was also due to expire, on the day that Vance's flight to Islamabad was canceled, on the day that Trump extended the Iran ceasefire indefinitely, and on the day that Ghalibaf was posting about new cards on the battlefield. They arrived into the specific media and diplomatic environment in which every newsroom was covering Trump's ceasefire extension at 4:09 p.m. Eastern, and Iran's response saying the extension means nothing. The Hezbollah rocket attack and the drone intercept above Kfar Yuval and Ma'ayan Baruch were initially misclassified by the IDF itself as a false identification, which reveals the institutional chaos of an air defense and intelligence system, processing multiple simultaneous crisis inputs across Lebanon, Hormuz, Islamabad, and the White House simultaneously. The IDF later corrected the false identification classification. After examination confirmed the sirens were triggered by real interceptions. Times of Israel, The National, Israel Hayom, and Ynet all confirmed the rockets and drone from overlapping sourcing. Hezbollah's public statement claiming responsibility and citing Israeli violations as justification creates the specific legal and rhetorical standoff that every ceasefire in this region produces. Each party cites the other's violations as justification for its own. The cycle of violation and counter-violation escalates, and the original terms of the ceasefire become irrelevant to the operational reality on the ground. The IDF calling Hezbollah's rocket fire a blatant violation is accurate within the text of the April 16th agreement. Hezbollah calling it a response to blatant and documented Israeli violations is supported by the legal agenda's 220 breach count. Both claims are simultaneously true in the specific factual sense that both parties have violated the ceasefire by any objective count. The question that the yellow line, the 220 Israeli violations, the French UNIFIL death, the Hezbollah tank ambush, and the Tuesday rocket fire together answer is the question that the ceasefire's framing never answered. On what terms does Lebanon's south become a place where 2 million displaced people can permanently return? Hezbollah's condition, stated publicly by Qasem, is a complete cessation of all hostilities. Israel's condition, stated publicly by Netanyahu, is a security strip 10 kilometers deep that is stronger, more intense, more continuous, and more solid than what existed before. Those two conditions are irreconcilable in their current form. A complete cessation of all hostilities means Israel does not operate inside Lebanon. A security strip 10 kilometers deep that is stronger than anything previously means Israel operates continuously inside Lebanon. The 10-day ceasefire is not a bridge between those two positions. It is a pause that allowed Israel to formally announce a buffer zone, whose announcement was itself a ceasefire violation, and that continues to generate violations daily as Israel enforces a zone Hezbollah refuses to recognize. Trump invited Netanyahu and Lebanese President Aoun to the White House for peace talks. And the direct Israel-Lebanon negotiations that are scheduled for Thursday, April 22nd, constitute the first direct diplomatic engagement between the two countries in decades. But those talks will occur while 55 Lebanese villages remain empty of their residents under Israeli military control, while Israeli forces continue active operations in the Yellow Line zone, citing self-defense exceptions. And while Hezbollah has fired its first rockets since the ceasefire began and said its fighters' hands remain on the trigger, the first round of direct Israel-Lebanon talks in over 40 years is opening on the day after the ceasefire's structural integrity was visibly broken from both sides simultaneously. The Lebanese government cannot disarm Hezbollah faster than Hezbollah can fire rockets. Israel will not leave the Yellow Line before the talks produce a permanent agreement. And the permanent agreement the talks are supposed to produce will be negotiated while the Yellow Line remains in place. While Hezbollah fires sporadically in response to Israeli violations it documents and numbers, and while the memory of Sergeant Major Florian Montorio's ambush in Gandourieh reminds every European government contributing troops to UNIFIL that the ceasefire zone is not safe for peacekeepers, even when both parties have agreed, in writing, to stop fighting. Here's exactly where things stand on Wednesday morning, April 22nd, 2026, in the full context of the Yellow Line and Hezbollah's first strike. The 10-day Israel-Lebanon ceasefire took effect on the night of April 16th, following 46 days of war that killed 2,294 and wounded 7,544. Within hours of the ceasefire, Israeli forces conducted demolitions, artillery shelling, and land clearing operations that Lebanese officials and the legal agenda documented as violations. On April 18th, the IDF announced the Yellow Line, a 10-kilometer security zone across the entire Lebanese border encompassing 55 villages where residents were forbidden from returning, modeled explicitly on Gaza. Netanyahu confirmed the strip was 10 kilometers deep and stronger than any previous arrangement. The legal agenda documented 220 Israeli violations in the first 3 days. April 18th, French UNIFIL Sergeant Major Florian Montorio, killed in Ganduria ambush, 3 others wounded. Macron attributed the killing to Hezbollah. Hezbollah denied it. UN Secretary General Guterres condemned it. April 19th, Hezbollah used explosive devices against Israeli tank column between Tebe and Deir Syrian. April 21st, Hezbollah fired several rockets at IDF troops in Rab al-Thalathin, launched a drone toward Israel. IDF intercepted the drone before it crossed. IDF struck the rocket launcher within minutes. IDF classified it as blatant violation. Hezbollah said attacks came in response to blatant documented Israeli violations. The Yellow Line remains. The 55 villages remain empty, the 1-to-1. 2 million displaced have mostly been unable to return to the most affected areas. The first direct Israel-Lebanon talks in over 40 years open in Washington on Thursday, April the 23rd. The ceasefire has 6 days left on its 10-day clock. The rockets were fired on day 5. 220 Israeli violations were documented in the first 3 days. Naim Qassem said the fighters' hands remain on the trigger. Netanyahu said the security strip is stronger, more intense, more continuous, and more solid than what existed previously. This is what the 10-day ceasefire looks like from the inside. The Yellow Line was declared during the ceasefire. The ceasefire was declared to allow Lebanon to recover. Lebanon cannot recover while its southern territory is inside a military zone that Israel has announced it is keeping. And Hezbollah, which signed nothing, trusts no one, and watched its fighters fall to Israeli strikes on motorcycles and in ambushes and on roads inside the ceasefire's first 24 hours, fired its answer to all of that on Tuesday evening. The sirens sounded in Kfar Yuval and Ma'ayan Baruch. The Iron Dome intercepted the drone. The troops in Rab al-Thalathin dove for cover. And the 10-day ceasefire that was supposed to be the beginning of 40 years of missing peace moved another day closer to the moment when Qassem's hands on the trigger become hands that did not wait.